Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews, and part 3 of my AZ Models BF109 F4/R1 build. In this final episode, we'll be finishing off the model, doing a bit of weathering, and adding the last of the final details. With the matte varnish now cured, I started with some metal chipping. This was created using my preferred method of some Model Air aluminium applied using a fine brush after most of the wet paint had been dabbed off or wiped off the brush. I then dabbed this onto the areas of the model where I wanted to create some metal chipping, which was mainly on the walkway area and leading edges of the wing, the landing gear hub and doors, around the access hatches for the cowling, other moving parts like the flaps and metal edges near the controls, and on the propeller blades. These are parts that are all generally either exposed to crew, movement, dirt and debris, or air resistance, but reference photos are definitely great to have a look at. While the aluminium chipping dried, I painted the exhausts a base coat of Vallejo model colour gold, and once the aluminium had dried, I then mixed up some white with both RLM 65 as well as 71 and RLM 02, which were the camouflage colours, to create a lighter paint than the camouflage. These lighter colours were then used to create some additional chipping, this time more subtle lighter patches and scratches of paint, making it appear the paint had gradually worn off rather than just been stripped bare to the aluminium. You can also use these lighter colours to highlight raised details on fabric control surfaces, and soften the metal chipping effect by applying it over the top of it, making it more subtle and realistic for certain aircraft. The same technique of using aluminium and then a lighter version of the base colour was used to chip the spinner and propeller blades, along with applying some of the darker RLM 70 to make the white look a bit chipped and faded. With the chipping done, I then applied some heavily watered down Vallejo model colour dark rust onto the exhausts to weather and dull them down a bit, and once this dried, I'd got out some Tamiya black panel assent and applied it over all of the recessed panels and details on the upper surface, along the edges of the controls, and around the engine. This would create some post shading and also replicate a build-up of dirt and grime in the panel gaps. On the lighter undersides, I also used some brown enamel wash for a more subtle effect, as well as to try and replicate lighter grime such as oil coolant and dirt. As you can see, the effect is very extreme, so to tone this down and make sure the wash is mainly in the recesses, I then get a cotton bud and dip it in some X20 enamel thinners and rub this over the entire model, as much as possible rubbing from nose to tail to streak any excess enamel wash in the direction air would push any leaks. With the enamel wash done, the next step in my weathering process was to add some oil paints. I squeezed a drop of Tylong 502 flat black along with some engine grime, white, buff and flat earth oil paints onto a piece of cardboard and left them aside for 2 hours for the excess oil to leak out of the paints. After the 2 hours, I then reactivated some of the engine grime and black using AK Interactive odorless thinners, and I used a small brush to dab it onto the exhausts, along the sides of the fuselage and the top part of the wing based on references to create some exhaust stains. I also added a tiny bit around the base of the 20mm cannon pods for some gun smoke. The dabs were then streaked and blended using a larger brush and some odorless thinners, and then I applied some of the odorless thinners onto the underside of the aircraft and used the fine brush to add some small streaks of oil, grease and coolant around the radiators, the landing gear and the fuselage based on reference photos. The flat earth and buff oil paints were then used on the landing gear bay doors, the underside of the wings, the base of the rudder, and on the wheels to create a build-up of dried mud and dirt, as if the aircraft had been operating out of rough grass airstrips on the Russian steppes. I spent time building up the layers and then softening the excess with the thinners, and then repeating until I was happy with the effect. I also used the odorless thinners to feather down the edges of some of the oil paints until I had a nice soft effect where I was happy with it. With the oil weathering finished, the aircraft was pretty much ready for the last of its final details. One of the wheels had come off during the weathering process, but I decided to leave it off temporarily while I painted both the nav lights and part of the landing gear shock with some Model Air RLM01 silver. This would replicate the bare shiny metal on the struts and also act as a base colour for the nav lights. Unfortunately, the propeller also snapped off its lock during this stage, so I ended up having to secure it on with some blue tack so that I could still rotate the propeller if I wanted to. Next I got out the armoured headrest, add-on armour glass and the canopy, and used a bit of microsec crystal clear to glue the add-on armour to the front of the canopy. The crystal clear is a bit like a sort of PVA glue that glues plastic pretty well and dries clear, although I did find that it left a few tide marks. The 20mm cannon was also repaired along with the rogue wheel, and once the antenna had been added to the canopy, I then glued the canopy's armoured headrest using some deluxe material rocket odorless CA glue. The kit's included gun sight was then glued to the instrument panel, and after a quick test fit, I then glued the control balances to the wings. Unfortunately, I lost one of the kit's originals, but fortunately the Eduard 109, which I'll be building soon, actually has several spares, so I ended up using one from that kit. The cannons and machine guns, which were still on the sprue, received a coat of Vallejo Model Air Gunmetal Metallic, and after some adjustments to the gun sight, I started painting the canopy frames. First with 2 coats of RLM66 to replicate the interior colour, and then with some RLM71 to match the external camouflage colour. Since I'd used AK and Vallejo acrylic paints, the paint could be gently scratched off to neaten the framework up, which I find much easier than masking the canopy up, as long as you scratch gently and before the paint has had too long to cure to avoid having any scratches or paint that's too difficult to remove. The nav lights were then painted using Tamiya clear red on the left side and clear green on the right, which produces a nice effect when applied over the silver from earlier. The machine guns were cut out and then glued to the cowling, and then I used some AK pigment fixer and some Humroll black pigments to try and replicate some gun smoke on the barrels, although I probably need to work on this technique a bit more as I wasn't really happy with the results. And the last details to add to the aircraft were the rigging wires. I used my typical duo of AK Interactive's mega thin rigging wire, glued in place with Deluxe Materials rocket odorless CA glue. First I glue the larger antenna to the mast, then stretch it to the tail, cutting away the excess once that has been glued to the tail, and then I add the smaller wire leading to the fuselage. I've seen various ways that the smaller antenna is attached to the aircraft's fuselage, so I decided to go with what the marking guide illustrated to position the wire. The final thing to do was to paint the control balances with some RLM65 to match the underside of the fuselage, and with that, my AZ Models BF109 F4/R1 was finally completed. And here you can see the finished model. So starting off with the negative points, I probably did the underside streaks and stains a little bit too heavily, but that's something I can easily tone back and something I plan to do on my next 109 builds. I'm super happy with how the masking and the modelling turned out. I think it's probably one of my best paint jobs to date. Although since building this one, I have dug a little deeper and it seems unlikely the 109Fs ever actually used the early war colours I used in this scheme, as it was apparently phased out with the end of E model production. Looking at Eduard's various releases of F models featuring similar schemes, they all seem to be with the mid-war colours, but I really like the look of the early colours on this aircraft, and it's not an entirely impossible scheme. It could have been that a factory had old paint stocks, or perhaps a unit in the field decided to repaint their aircraft. This seemed to happen quite often in some Luftwaffe units, and could give me an excuse as to why some of these small common stencils are not applied. The kit itself is definitely more detailed than the Airfix Italeri and old Hella 109s I've previously built, though definitely not as precise fitting as any of those kits, with a lot of fragile joints for the landing gear, no guide pins in most places, and a bit more sanding and filling required. And of course, there was the unfortunate case that a lot of those common stencils were unusable in this kit. I don't recall having the common stencils in the last AZ model I built have this happen, so hopefully this was just a bad batch of decals, but obviously this is still not good. I think as well as improving on their decals, AZ should have really done a 3-piece canopy so that you could have it open, as there's no pilot figure, and it would be nice given the incredible cockpit detail they've managed to mould with the plastic. Nevertheless, I still thoroughly enjoyed building this kit, and so far the AZ-109 has proven to be one of my favourite kits of the type in 1/72nd scale for a more detailed build with a lot of different schemes available in various boxings. The price can vary depending on which issue of 109 you're getting, but in general they range from around 25 to 35 AUD, which seems reasonable enough given their level of detail. I would definitely recommend this kit to a more experienced modeler. Overall, I'm really happy with how this kit turned out and the results I achieved, and I very much look forward to applying what I've learnt to the next 109s I do in the future. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel as it really helps out. And if you want to help fund me not only buying these kits and the products I use to make them, but also funds the time I spend making these videos, then please be sure to check out my Patreon page, a link to which I'll leave in the description. A massive thank you to all of my current patrons for their amazing support. I really appreciate it. Next week, I'm hoping to have the Lancaster stop motion finally ready to go, and after that, I'll also have some Corsair build videos. There'll also be one coming for the Eduard BF-109 at some point, although I haven't actually started that kit just yet. I've been wanting to build up a bit of skills before I tackle the big one. And of course, I'll be doing a full version of this build that combines all three parts, so if you want to watch them all together, you can check that one out. Otherwise though, thanks again, and until the next video, as always, take care and model on.